It's 5 o'clock in London, midday in New York, midnight in Hong Kong, 2 a.m. in Sydney, 9 a.m. in San Francisco, and 9:30 at night in Mumbai. Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. My name is Patrick L. Young. The IPO-VID live stream, Series 25, Episode 2 in the aggregate. That's episode number 146. Starts here. Ladies and gentlemen, the T+1 child is born. Settlement triumphant on Wall Street, along with Canada, Mexico, and don't forget Jamaica, who all moved last week. Billions already being saved in collateral, while early fail rates were below the last days of T+2 across the same terrains. Of course, that's not to say that actually they were the first people there. We know lots of people have reached it already, but nonetheless, the truth of the matter is more than 65% of the world's market cap moved to T+1 in essentially one day. Speaking of what is it, about 63, 64%, probably be fairer, total of market capitalization in the world that moved to T+1. One place not moving to T+1 for a while yet is going to be Europe. The Federation of European Securities Exchanges, great folks at FASI Brussels, they are pushing the agenda as we approach the European parliamentary elections this weekend, in the hope that the European Union can find some market mojo once again. Absolutely fabulous to see FASE leading the debate for EU capital markets. I can't help say I'm a little bit concerned about the fact that there were 1,789 listings, that being the year of the French Revolution, at the point in time they discussed this over the course of the last 10 years across the EU 27. Nonetheless, a revolution I suspect we must have, ladies and gentlemen. Don't forget one of those horrible, grim growth numbers of the past 15 years. European Union, 9% growth. United States of America, 86% growth. What were once equivalent economies, now the European Union is a third less than the United States of America. We need capital markets union. We need capital markets union now. And the people who are leading the debate in that project is FASE. Good for you, all of the team at FASE Brussels. Let's see how we get that roughly 12 trillion euros, $12 trillion of household savings in the European Union, out investing and working for a better future for the citizens and the corporations of Europe. Meanwhile, even the former LSEG CEO Xavier Rollet has joined the calls to have London's struggling stock market reborn with government help. Will the likely election on July the 4th of a socialist regime under Keir Starmer truly help the London stock market? Watch this space. Our guest today, ladies and gentlemen, is a returning guest. We've had him on the show on many occasions, both as a guest and also a co-presenter, where his expertise in all aspects of carbon and related green and sustainable markets has been invaluable. Steve Zwick returns with us to give us an update on carbon market development. Just in case you don't remember his background, Steve is a former futures broker and trader. He writes about the economics of sustainable development and the interplay between land use and climate change, subjects he developed a fascination for during a 30-year career that brought him from Chicago's trading pits and has led to all manner of interesting exercises in yurts and across deserts and weird and wonderful places in the world, including subsistence farms in rural parts of Kenya, Vietnam, and Brazil. As a multimedia journalist, Steve has worked across the world, from the Chicago Reader, Fortune, and Time magazines to Germany's Deutsche Welle radio, and he now produces the fabulous, unmissable, I think best in the whole subject area, Bionic Planet podcast. Steve, welcome back to the show. Where in the world are you today?
Thank you, Patrick. I'm in Chicago, right where I grew up, back home.
When you grew up. How is Chicago these days?
It's hot. It's hot and humid, but it's beautiful. It's nice, and I feel like I'm in the tropics. So I might as well be down there in Turks and Caicos with you.
Turks and Caicos. I am in the tropics, and I can tell you it is unbelievably hot during the course of today. I'm going to feel like one of those drivers who's going to do the NASCAR race in Chicago in a few months' time. I might as well be in my heat suit at 150 degrees or something, heading around the riverfront. It's absolutely wild here today, quite still, and we're awaiting a storm. So, Steve, lots has been happening in this, incredibly dizzyingly exciting world of carbon markets. And I think, it's important to probably kick off with a couple of useful stats just to get an idea on the perspective of this whole thing. I had a great conversation yesterday with an Exchange Investor reader, and he was saying, look, if you include everybody, the consensus, the global academic, scientific gurus, good gurus, bad gurus, whatever, including some that this particular correspondent didn't particularly rate. But nonetheless, we're talking about something like $150 trillion has to be spent on decarbonisation by something like 2050. And at the same point in time, right now, the total of the world's stock markets are market capitalized at, I don't know, roughly around 100 trillion US dollars. I mean, corporate bonds are like 140 trillion US dollars. So these are mega numbers we're talking about. Global GDP, good grief, we're spending 1.5 times global GDP. Global GDP is about 100, just tipped over, I think 103, 104 trillion expected to be this year. That's absolutely incredible sets of numbers. So there's a lot happening. What's the really top level trends that have been breaking out in the course of the last time we saw you about a year ago?
Well, for the area I'm in, because I do focus on land use, not energy, not the energy transition, though they're interrelated. And I think for what I focus on, the biggest changes have actually happened in the last few weeks, which have been long in coming. One is that the United States government put out guidance on how to recognize voluntary carbon credits, and they essentially took to people who've been in this for a long time. There's nothing new. It's the same principles that the ICVCM, which is the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, have laid out. The same principles that have been around for 20 or 30 years, but they've never been formally kind of put together in one big place like this and agreed to through rigorous processes of expert review and multilateral debate. And so that kind of put a stamp of approval on the voluntary carbon market, which again is not, the voluntary carbon market, keep in mind, is not the compliance market. The voluntary market has been catching a lot of heat the last few years, I think wrongly, because the voluntary carbon market was created explicitly to try to incentivize action beyond what's required by law, not to replace the law, and also to test new methodology. So it's caught a lot of heat, most of it, I think, unjustified. And they've essentially said, we do need the voluntary carbon markets. This is the U.S. government. We needed to follow these principles, and we will get behind it to ensure that it does that. And the U.S. government is also getting involved. I mean, the Department of Agriculture has for a long time been talking about overseeing carbon markets that will benefit farmers by incentivizing or financing sustainable land management. The Department of Energy is starting to buy like carbon removal projects. So there's a lot of different, a lot of things have been in the works for a long time, and they kind of came out, this big coordinated effort to say, we endorse this, but only if it's done right. And then the other thing that happened was the SBTI, which is called, the name is a little bit wonky. It's called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And they are created by a consortium of NGOs, the Climate Disclosure or the Carbon Disclosure Project, WWF, WRI. They have been, because the big thing overriding all of this is that we have to get to net zero emissions by 2050. Net zero is a science-based target. It comes from the IPCC. They basically said, if we're going to meet the Paris targets, we've got to get to a point by 2050 where we've squeezed all of the emissions out that we can and are using carbon markets to only removal-based carbon markets to pull out the residual emissions, to suck them out. So that's where we have to be by 2050. And there's always been this debate about, well, what is the role of carbon markets in doing this? Because the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or the net zero target, is global. It doesn't say every single company has to be there. Some companies can get there faster than others. Some companies, will always have residual emissions. How do you decide if a company is on track to do that? And that's what the SBTI has been doing. And they've always argued that you can't use offsets to get to sort of get on target for achieving net zero emissions, which has been a big point of contention. And they finally announced a couple of weeks ago that they would recognize the use of offsets for Scope 3 emissions. And Scope 3 emissions are outside of the value chain. They're basically, they include everything that your customers do, everything when you buy a carpet, if you run a vacuum cleaner over it, that's considered Scope 3. So Scope 3 is pretty inclusive, and that created a lot of consternation because it was a big pivot for them. There's actually been a lot of debate because people are saying that the decision was made without a lot of transparency. There was no real vision, real sight into the deliberative process. I think that's a legitimate a legitimate concern. But at the same time, the SBTI is one of these things that was never meant to be as big as it is. It's a voluntary initiative that was created a long
Mhm.
time ago, and it's kind of it's the only thing standing. So it kind of had more influence than I think a lot of people expected it to.
I must admit, I mean, you're diving into organizations. A lot of these organizations, yes, we
Mm.
get the World Wildlife, WWF, all of those sorts of top line carbon people you're talking about. But this SBTI, I must admit, it's sort of unleashing my inner Dan Brown complexity, theory, conspiracy, you name it. Give us a little bit of the history, I mean, roughly of the SBTI. Where is it based and what does its membership consist of?
Well, that's actually interesting. It's a very narrow membership. It's based. I'm not even sure. I mean, it's probably based in Switzerland. I'd have to look. I don't know.
Based in one of those
Um,
neutral places with nice weather or good skiing or somewhere. One of
something
our
like
research team in the galley will probably have a quick look and see where the SBTI is and have a guess. So right, it's somewhere.
yeah.
It's another one of those sort of multinational entities. But it's interesting because if you don't know, then I think we can rapidly define the fact that it's not been something that's necessarily been top of mind for everybody around the world to actually look at.
Well, no, but it kind of did become. It's a weird thing that happened was when these
Mhm.
net zero companies started making these net zero commitments, and most of the companies that made net zero commitments are companies that have never put much thought into this before.
Right.
So I just had Jen Jenkins on the show on my show the other day, and she was saying that 90% of the companies that have made commitments under the SBTI didn't make them until 2023. So these are companies that have, for the most part, not been engaging in the carbon market, not been really thinking about emission reductions, and they've come out with these pledges to have net zero by 2050, and to be recognized under the SBTI, you have to come in with a plan that actually aligns. You have to be able to say, because what the SBTI does is they look at every different sector. They look at existing technologies, potential future technologies, and they try to say, okay, if you're in the airline industry, this is where you can be by 2030. This is where you can be by 2035, based on what we know about the current technologies, to identify what is a reasonable expectation that you're going to arrive at that endpoint. But so many companies started making net zero pledges, and until recently a lot of them were doing it by using carbon markets in the short term to kind of zero out their current emissions, and then having some kind of a strategy for getting to net zero eventually. What the SBTI, then when they came out and said, hey, we've got this stepwise approach, and if you sign up with us, you can say, look, at this point we're here, at this point we're here, we are aligned. And they came out with that, and no one else had. So a lot of companies committed to the SBTI. I don't know the exact numbers offhand, but it's huge. It always confused me that so many companies were aligning with something that they didn't seem to understand. And it does seem that a lot of them are waking up now to the enormity of the challenge they really face. And they're kind of going, we can't get there. And now there's this move. This was one of the critiques on the SBTI. And again, not to keep hyping my own show, but I had Jen Jenkins from Rubicon Carbon on, and she was kind of arguing that, you have this kind of purist versus pragmatist debate, where a lot of these companies are going, we want to make a voluntary commitment to this, but we can't get there with these guidelines that are so strict. We need to have some way of using offsets to get us out of this pickle, so that we can still continue to have an impact and moving the whole world towards net zero. But I'd have to look up the exact numbers, but lots of companies are aligned with it, and I just don't know the
Mhm.
exact number
So
offhand.
okay, but we've had a huge corporate awakening. It sounds to me like the scariest kind of corporate awakening you can have, because these zombie blob corporations suddenly come awake and they go, "Oh yeah, I'm going to do that," and they've done it on the classic Main Street thing of, "Well, the guys across the road just did it," and therefore at some board meeting everybody goes, "Well, we'd better do that as well," or
Yeah.
someone in marketing decides that it's going to be a thing. And now we've got a huge hangover where they're trying to go, actually, how do we get to those numbers, when they realize how relatively strict the regulations are? So if I understand you correctly, one of the things the SBT has done is actually it started slightly relaxing what was previously a rather dirigiste stance, which should at least help some kinds of corporation move forward.
Yeah, and only on scope 3 emissions. So they started to relax. There was a big blow up over that, because a lot of people are arguing that using, there's the arguments are essentially that you've got net zero is one thing, carbon neutral is another. Carbon neutral has become a bad term, I think, because of bad press, but generally carbon neutral is the here and now. What are we doing to offset our current emissions? And net zero is the ultimate goal. And there's been this argument that you cannot use offsets to get to net zero unless they're removal based, where you're sucking stuff out, and even that is only at the very end. So yeah, they've introduced some flexibility, but there was no deliberative process. I mean, I guess my own personal view, I would say I endorse the move, but I understand people who say there was no real debate. I mean, if you look at the carbon standards, or the Integrity Council, everything they do goes through this very rigorous and very public consultation phase where everybody's voice gets heard, and then they reach a decision. And with SBTI, two things happen. One, it used to be just these few NGOs running it. Then they opened it up to a board, a larger board of directors, some of whom had been more proponents of using carbon credits. A lot of the heat that's coming in, this is, again, the critiques coming at it, is that the Bezos Earth Fund has now stepped in to start funding it. And the Bezos Earth Fund has generally been pro-market. So there's a lot of people saying, that, the Bezos people twisted the arms, the U.S. government twisted the arms, that there was a lot of finagling that went on to get this relaxed. And I don't know how that's going to play out, but it is something where, on the one hand, I can say, yeah, they made what I consider a good decision for whatever my opinion's worth, but I can see why people say they didn't do it in a deliberative way.
And actually, therein you hit upon an interesting issue, because I don't want to get involved in the politics of the Bezos Foundation versus SBT or something, but there continues, it seems to me, to be a relative uneasiness in the overall, however you want to describe this, let's call it the carbon sphere or something. I mean, whatever way you want to term it, but there seems to be a very uneasy standoff between the money and a lot of the people who are deciding stuff or trying to dictate stuff, who are predominantly NGO based and therefore have a natural affinity, because we all got an affinity with money because we need it to exist, but they're somewhat wary because they tend to always see untowards motives as somebody does something deeply environmentally unfriendly in the background on the streets of Chicago. Yeah. They do something, you've got this standoff. And that always seems to me to be difficult, because it strikes me that actually, and I'm not speaking specifically, but quite a lot of, particularly the big foundations that have been funding, have actually come in with incredibly open motives, if not actually motives that are fundamentally not in the best interests of the sources of where their original funding came from.
Yeah, I guess it depends what timescale you're looking at too. I mean, if you're looking at, maybe for the next quarter, it's not in favor, but if you're looking at 20 years down the road, if we don't get this thing taken care of, we're pretty screwed. I mean, it's pretty scary. Sorry about the language, but so, and I do think that the people who advocate for use of markets, I think there is a big ideological divide, and it's clear that there's an ideological divide, and there always has been. I'm actually, if I can throw another plug in, I'm doing a series that I'm calling The Tribes of the Climate Realm, to try to just identify who the different ideological clusters that we have in this space, because there are some people who are ideologically opposed to markets, and they'll often use pseudo-technical arguments to against markets rather than make their own ideological argument. And then there are people who are, I'd say, probably too ideologically in favor. There's a libertarian realm that says we need no government. The general sense is government needs to step up, but government needs to draw hard lines, and we need to have markets to find the most effective way of getting there. Markets can drive money into the most cost-effective reduction and mitigation activities, and then you get into this issue of, are they really working? And I think then you get into another issue, which is that there's different markets. There's the voluntary markets, there's the compliance markets, and they're slightly different. And I think one of the big problems we've had over the last 15 years is that governments fell asleep. Governments did nothing. So I wouldn't say nothing, but governments certainly didn't live up to what they should have been doing. and the voluntary carbon market, which was created to fill in the gaps and kind of incentivize additional action, was the only thing standing. And then when all these people woke up to the enormity of the challenge we face, the only thing standing became a target, and people went after it. I kind of digressed. I don't know if I answered your question.
I think you're right though. But it's an interesting point. I think actually you did answer the question, because the answer is hashtag it's complicated, and B, over the long term, the money wherever it's come from essentially, and the NGOs, the other interested parties, are going to have to get into bed together, because otherwise nothing's going to go anywhere. But we do have, and that's very interesting. You've got this series going on Bionic Planet talking about who all the different vested interests are, because what I notice is, okay, we're super pro markets. That's what we're about. We're exchange invest, IPO-VID. We love markets, but at the same time, we understand the fact that there's got to be regulation for a reason. There's got to be a certain degree of government involvement. So we're not at the totally libertarian end of the field. We get that. But it does strike me that one of the very frustrating things to this debate, and one of the reasons why I'm so glad you're here today to try and break this down for people like us who are just not following it day by day, is a huge chunk of the popular media just appear to be on that line of least resistance, which is markets are evil and wave crucifixes in the air, and only some, and I don't know whether that's the spaghetti monster or man bear pig can possibly rescue us from a miraculous future, which doesn't sound terribly logical to me. It sounds even less logical than the idea that an unfettered market will. So it's quite fascinating, and I think that's a big problem at the moment. If I mean, my observation is in sort of the carbon sphere coverage, we get so much media that comes in where it's essentially people who don't believe in markets in the first place, so they're just not going to be able to give us an objective coverage. I'm not asking them to fawn over markets, but it would be better that they don't start with the idea of markets are bad.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I think that's pretty clear. The fact a lot of the funding for a lot of the so-called research that's going into, that's kind of exposés on market-based activities, is coming from groups that are kind of shadowy and have a history of always funding anti-market propaganda, for lack of a better word. There's a company in Germany called Olin GmbH. No one knows really. I mean, someone knows where they get their money, but they're funding a lot of this stuff. That's this so-called, this alleged research that's against carbon markets, or that's uncovering so-called flaws in these programs. And I mean, and a lot of, usually what it ends up doing is, and I think here the thing is, none of these projects are perfect. I mean, that's, I think the first thing we have to understand is, when I'm looking at RED, which is avoided deforestation, you're going into an area that you say is under threat. You say that, we want to reduce that threat, and that's what the carbon finance is going to do. And if you're looking at a RED project, usually like in Africa, it will work by providing alternative income sources. If the deforestation is coming from people chopping trees to make charcoal, you provide other alternative livelihoods. You get them on agroforestry. You start providing scholarship funds, because a lot of times people are burning trees to send their kids to school. And you also bring rangers in and stuff like that. And there was a recent investigation into a project called the Kassegal Corridor project down in Kenya. I've been to that project, and this was a group out of the Netherlands called SOMA, where they went in and they found that the head of the Ranger Corps was essentially pressuring women into having sex with him. And it turned out to be true. It was true. It was not something they made up. But the proponent looked into it, and they found that, yeah, he was doing this. He was saying, hey, you sleep with me, you get a promotion. And then the women had reported it to the head of to the head of personnel, and they didn't follow up. Kind of like what happens on college campuses. It just, it shouldn't happen. It did. Now, that was a legitimate finding. The proponent acted pretty quickly, fired them both, and hired outside people to come in and do an investigation. Now the NGO is claiming this means the whole project is bad. They're also claiming that they're calling it systemic sexual abuse, like they were, running Jeffrey Epstein's island out there, but they weren't. And and this is, that's the kind of thing where they're cherry picking a lot of times on this. And the funding, this group SOMA, if you look, if just real quick, is if you look at the research, if you look at the interviews people from SOMA have given, it's all anti-market. I mean, they're basically arguing time and time again that we need to stop trying to get companies to be responsible. We need to because that just takes the pressure off of governments, or companies are trying to say, if we got this covered, we don't need regulation. That's their argument. But that's not really the argument I've heard. When I go to these events, when you go to the Tropical Forest Alliance or something, these are companies that are doing the right thing. They're not arguing for no regulation. In fact, they're arguing for regulation. The companies that are doing the wrong thing are saying, well, of course they want regulation because they're already there. It gives them an advantage. So the whole narrative is just, there's this public discourse that's completely disconnected from what's really happening in these spaces.
Yeah, it's terrible, because when you look at some of the things that happened with certain, for example, UN funded projects in recent years, where they had, genuinely did have embedded examples of sexual abuse and so on, yet nobody turns around and goes, well, the UN's a bad idea, we'd better get rid of it. They recognize the fact that there were some hideously rotten apples who were probably badly managed. And it is interesting. Of course, the other problem is that the more that people try to undermine markets, the more that they can in some way succeed, because, of course, a lot of markets is confidence and trust, which is difficult. But, that then leads us to, I suppose, in a way, you do get a lot of slightly changing gear, but nonetheless, a media comment that is often seen, or a comment that is often allowed in the media, is that people suggest that essentially the broader base of carbon markets are fixed. And this one I find quite interesting, because I personally can't believe it, just because I know the great actors that are in there, whether it be the Intercontinental Exchange, NASDAQ, hundreds of others, major reputable regulated exchanges worldwide, who've got far too much on the line to possibly waste their time fixing what is still a relatively small part of their business. But it's just, it's a scary concept, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess there's two things. One is people will say that they're fixed in the sense of being rigged. I've never seen, I think that comes from this idea that they were pretty small and provincial, just because nobody was really, nobody else was stepping up to build them. So that may create that perception. I think the bigger perception now is that they're broken, and that these big smart people are stepping in to fix something that's broken. And I see that as a wrong narrative and a dangerous one. And it's ironically, it's one that market proponents have gotten behind, because the issue with these markets is they're evolving. They're not, they were, when they were creating those first methodologies, no one had done that before. And they said at the start, this was a very meticulous process. Involving hundreds and hundreds of researchers and dozens of pilot projects throughout the 1990s. And by the time they sat down and created these methodologies, everything was like, okay, we'll do this. This is how all the science lines up. We're using the latest in land change modeling and everything else. And we're going to come back after 10 years and see how it all goes. And the idea at that time, people were thinking that governments were going to step up. This was all about incentivizing early action, because it was like, we deforestation is happening. We need to get things in place. And then in 5 or 10 years, governments are going to come in and absorb this anyway. So let's just get this set up based on the best available science. By the time governments come along, we'll know what needs to be changed and what doesn't. And governments never came along, and they continued on in this way with very little money. They were underfunded. People don't realize these red projects were bleeding red ink for the last decades. The first ones came along in 2011. They weren't making any money. They finally started to sell credits in around 2020, 2018 was when you started to see the demand pick up. And at that point, they started getting funding. And then Vera, the standard setting body that I did work for briefly, started getting funding too. And what they did, to their credit, they didn't put it into PR or anything like that. They put it into a secondary review on the independent auditors, because they realized, they started to suspect that the independent auditors, some of them were asleep at the switch, but this is really complicated. So they started to put in an audit on the audits, and that slowed a lot of things down, but they found a lot of companies were sloppy. And I think when you hear all this talk about those first generation methodologies being bad or whatever, they were complicated was the problem. They had too many variables. And they were difficult to really verify, just because of all the things to look at. So they adjusted. They shortened the period between the time when you reevaluate a project from 10 years down to 6. They also implemented the secondary reviews, and they started this whole process of creating a whole new methodology based on jurisdictional data, newer forms of remote sensing, and the lessons learned on what were the most predictive variables over the previous 10 years. So there were a lot of, that first phase yielded a lot of advancement. It was a huge
Mhm.
pilot project that yielded a lot of good data. And also those projects that are being held to account now are being accused of not having reduced their emissions. Some did. Some of them, they were too far away from the arc of deforestation. There were sometimes there are some projects that probably got credit for a lot more than they should have, but there are also a lot of projects who got credit for a lot less than they should have. And you want it to balance out in the end. I mean, you know, they didn't get it all right. So I don't want to sit here and say everything was perfect, but that's not broken. That's like,
Yeah.
that's like slapping a 12-year-old for not passing his college entrance exam. That's not, the kid's not broken. He's just not there yet. And that's what was happening.
Yeah.
And this was the voluntary market. This was all about incentivizing additional action above and beyond what would have happened otherwise. So I think a lot of these, and I think what's happening is when we had the task force. Am I going on too long, or should I wrap this
No,
up?
go.
Okay.
That's fine. Talk
Okay.
to us about the task force.
Okay. The task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets. Mark Carney created this in, I think it was 2019 or so. And the idea was we need to scale up voluntary carbon markets. How do we do it? And I was on the task force. So and initially you had this call for a core carbon price, because people from the finance business, we think in terms of a reference price. They were looking at it like a bond market. Techies wanted a core carbon price too. And then that mutated into a core carbon price being like that, you needed more standardization, you needed to scale up, and then suddenly scaling became integrity. And I feel like there was a pivot in there, because it implies that the old stuff was no good, that there was no integrity in it. There was integrity. There's just, some things work better than others, but there was always integrity. And the pivot to the new methodology within Vera focused on the most predictive variables within. I'm trying to remember. I think I lost my train of thought here. Am I making
No, so
sense?
look, I let me stop for a second, because actually you make great sense. What you're essentially saying, to break it all down, is in version 1, huge numbers of incredibly optimistic people went out and populated this wonderful new land of voluntary carbon markets, and they created an absolute gigabytes of data, terabytes of data, and they took it all home. And then gradually over time, people have been analyzing it. And some people have said, because some of it didn't actually work properly, it's all a failure.
Right.
And a lot of other people are saying, well, actually, a lot of it worked, so let's do more of that. And then another, or possibly the same group of people, are saying, okay, there are problems here and ways we could tweak this, which to me sounds like the difference between, I'll use a petrol example. I hope that doesn't trigger any of the more green members of our audience, but the Ford Model T to the Ford Model A, the Ford Model T, there's nothing inherently wrong with it. It wasn't a bad car. If it was the first thing you ever got that managed to drive you around the countryside, it was a huge advance in your civilization in 1915. But the thing was, by the time they brought in the Ford Model A, it was more reliable, it was effortless, it was simpler. And the truth is, the DNA of whatever you drive today on the roads, a Toyota Yaris or something, is 90% of the Ford Model T. That doesn't mean the Ford Model T was a bad car. In its time, It was a really, really incredible, remarkable thing that it could be produced. Right. So that's what you're essentially saying. So what we're talking about here is a narrative of progress, sunny, kind of Reaganite optimism. The world's going to get better tomorrow, and we've all got to work at it. And actually, it's the tale of the United States of America, and what has ended up making it so important that the likes of the US is embracing so many elements of carbon markets at the moment, because it's 4.23% of the world's population, but it happens to be getting on for 20% of the world economy in its own right, and 60.5% of the world's capital markets in its own right. And that's important. So, I mean, that's what I'm hearing from you. Criticize me as you wish. And I mean, talking about that, actually, I'm going to give you a second to have a break, Steve, because let me just Tando off. Because as you know, we have a series of short videos on Big World. And as we give Steve a chance to catch a glass of water and recover for the next half of the show,
So I got it.
One of the topics we've had recently is talking about the bell ringing of the New York Stock Exchange. It's a wonderful and exciting event for everybody in the world. It's watched by 100 million people daily in its incarnations of the opening and closing bell. What a lot of people don't realize is how relatively recent it is as a media phenomenon. Way back before it was popularized by Ronald Reagan, which we discussed previously, its first instance of actually being rung that we can recall by a member of the public was by not an adult, not a stock trader, but by a young man who dazzled the American TV audience in the 1950s with his ability to answer questions about the stock market. Meanwhile, in Big World, continuing our theme of bell ringing at the New York Stock Exchange, one thing that's little known is that the modern public PR phenomenon of Bohr's campanology is relatively recent. It was a one-off in 1956 when a child prodigy, 10-year-old Leonard Ross, was invited to ring the bell, having previously electrified US TV viewers with a $100,000 win on the big prize, having answered questions about the stock market with victorious aplomb. Other notable bell ringers in their adolescence have included Make-A-Wish guests via the charity which helps children who have suffered extreme illness to bring and fulfill a burning ambition. Most recently, Luke Grettenberger rang the bell in early May 2024, while previously Nachiketa Bhatnagar rang the NICE bell via the Make-A-Wish Foundation in 2012. For more in Big World, like or follow. The wonderful power of Bohr's campanology there, ladies and gentlemen. Don't forget, what pays for this is this podcast to be able to go out, this live stream to be able to go out, IPO-VID, is, of course, our weekly and daily newsletters. Now, our weekly newsletter is entirely free EI Weekend. You can sign up to that easily enough. Our daily newsletter, Exchange Invest Daily, is available for only $375 per user year. Do please drop by and consider subscribing. You can get a free 7-day free trial for that at the moment. And actually, one of the things that we have in Exchange Invest Weekend Edition, EI Weekend, which is completely free, you can sign up for that, or the daily at exchangeinvest.com, is a book of the week. And this week's book of the week, actually, I can't help but think that it's a really good primer for thinking about carbon markets without, I believe, actually mentioning carbon markets whatsoever. Rory Sullivan is the marvelous author of this. In fact, we devoted the whole of the last EI weekend to the wit, wisdom, and wonderment of Rory Sullivan. He's the he's the vice chairman of Ogilvy in the UK. Alchemy is the magic of original thinking in a world of mind-numbing conformity. And for those of us who are sick of being locked in the box, sick of even having to think that there might be a box that we could be locked in, this is a wonderful book. Alchemy, the surprising power of ideas that don't make sense, strikes me as a very, very good example of a sort of tome that should be read by the sort of people who are looking to develop carbon markets going forward, because it may help them get away from straight line methodological problems and look at the lateral and other issues of what can be done where we could think less logically and nonetheless power society forward. Next book of the week coming in the EI Weekend. At the weekend, ladies and gentlemen, check out Rory Sutherland's tome. And back to Steve Zwick. So a little bit of lateral thinking there, I think, is something that can be very, very useful, Steve. So talking about this, central problem we've got, therefore, there are a series of critics of the, say, voluntary carbon markets, with markets and so on. And some of those are just anti-market people, which is really, really frustrating because they're not suddenly going to come back and say, oh, well, we think markets are actually good altogether. So they're undermining the process. Amongst the more pragmatic groups, what are the issues that they might have in terms of how the markets are working? Or are there particular ways in which they have proposed that markets need to work better?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, but it's a big answer.
Yeah, it is. Sorry, break it down.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the issues are procedural. I mentioned the VVBs, which are the independent auditors, and it was pretty clear that a lot of the auditors, even though they're recognized and they're chartered by governments and everything else, there was huge variability among them. So a lot of the people doing the auditing weren't technically proficient enough to really know when they went on the ground what they were supposed to be looking for. And I think that was a huge issue. There's also issues of and again, when I'm looking at land use, FPIC is a term, free, prior, and informed consent. How do you engage indigenous people or people on the land? I think this is an interesting one just because what was known from the very start is that if you engage people properly, your chances of success are really, really high. But there have been some projects where not enough money went to people on the ground, and that, to me, that's a big one because you have to, on the one hand, you're trying to attract foreign capital. You have to give people some kind of incentive to invest. They have to be able to take something away if it succeeds, and they're also taking the risk. But at the same time, if too much of it leaves the land, and the whole product is that we're putting money into these people on the ground, And yeah, and if you take that away, then you're kind of defeating the whole purpose. So there's this thing about benefit sharing. It needs to be more systematized. Although it's, again, I think the problem on that too is that if you look at how these things are structured, quite often the money doesn't go directly to people. It goes into activities. It goes into college funds. It goes into training. So you have to take all of that into account. Another big one is just the methodologies, and this is one where there's a lot of debate. If you look at what Vera is moving towards, and I think I talked about this the last time I was on, it's a new methodology for identifying those forests most at risk. And this is based on a lot of research that shows, in the early methodologies, they were trying to be as detailed as they could by looking at all the different things that could impact land, using land change modeling to do that. We just basically look at what happened here.
Mm-hmm.
These are the variables it's going to happen here. That's but what they found is, over time, the most predictive variables were pretty simple ones. Things like this, nearness to the edge of the forest, nearness to roads. There's a lot of different. There's a handful of variables that turned out to be very, very predictive in the short term, not necessarily in the long term. But in what this does is it drives money into the areas where the forests are most at risk. The negative on that, though, is it can in theory it can leave out a lot of areas where they don't fit that model, because there are areas where you have different drivers of deforestation. I mentioned charcoaling before. That won't be captured in this because of the nature of that deforestation. So the idea of creating a more standardized approach to modeling near-term drivers of deforestation and getting money flowing into that is a big change. And then the question is, how do you deal with these areas that are away from the forest edge? How do you deal with indigenous people who are supporting their forest and getting no money for it? How do you compensate all of these people? And that does become that's another issue that gets into this whole issue that people are moving towards now, which is nature positivity, which is quantifying the human or the impacts of human activities on biodiversity.
Okay, let me stop you there. Because I got to ask you then. So this is the first time today I've heard this. Pardon my ignorance, all viewers here suddenly writing me off as a complete heathen. Well, I could well be correct. Who knows? But the nature positivity, draw us into this and what it means. You've explained a very quick definition of what it means and why it's important, please.
Yeah, I'll do it with a little bit of a history if I can. Please. Try to do it really fast. Yeah, because what you already have investment biodiversity payments. You have them in the U.S. We have what's called mitigation banking. If you're going to do some kind of a land development, it's going to impact habitat for an endangered species, and you go through a process where you get approval to do it. You have to show that you're restoring an area of equal or greater ecological value in the same ecosystem. And a similar process exists in the UK, where this guy named David Hill, I think was his name, who kind of spearheaded this in the UK, creating a biodiversity crediting for if you go into an area. I think his area, he focused on newts. And if you're building houses in an area where there's a lot of newts and they're an endangered species, and if you're impacting that habitat, you have to restore an area of newt habitat that's been degraded, so that you can ensure that your net impact is. They used to talk about no net loss. What David came up with was this. He basically realized that the process of quantifying the impact is so extreme that instead of going for no net loss, you're better off just assuming the worst when you go in to do an ecological impact assessment. Instead of trying to find out how many newts are in an area, just assume that there's as many as can be, so that you have to have you have to restore an area that is much stronger in terms of a positive impact, than you would have if you try to hit the nail on the head. So that was this idea of going towards net gain, where any kind of project you do that has an impact on a habitat has to have a net gain on the ecosystem. Now that's where you're offsetting an impact. Nature positivity is a little bit different. It's using a lot of the same methodologies, because you can go in and you can quantify, and this is new methodologies that are coming out of Vera, coming out of Gold Standard, coming out of different areas. You can go in and you can say, okay, if we're implementing these practices, we're having a positive impact on biodiversity in a region, and it might be an indigenous territory, it might be an area far away from land, but you're managing the land more effectively. Things like cutting certain trees so that habitat becomes more, more inhabitable, for lack of a better word. And what they're trying to do with nature positivity, and this is where it's kind of iffy, where the demand's going to come from, because it's kind of philanthropy. With a carbon offset, that's a market because you're offering a claim. You're saying, okay, if you by you're reducing you're emitting greenhouse gases. If you do this emission reduction project in Belize and you're in Singapore, you're still going to have the same impact. With nature positivity, there is no negative impact that you're offsetting. It's more of a corporate governance kind of thing. And the question is, so what we know is now you can measure the impacts of human activity on biodiversity much more clearly than we could before. You can quantify it, but is there going to be a demand? What is a company going to get? Is it going to be just good old CSR? Because that's what didn't work before. Or have we come full circle? Is what didn't work before going to work now? So there's a question on where the demand is going to come from. And or if it's something like you can offset past impacts. That's kind of what people are talking about now. If you're a company that's done palm oil or something, maybe you're going to be incentivized to say, boy, in the past we were bad, we didn't know better, and now we're financing this. So the nature positivity is something it's kind of new. It's the demand side isn't as clear, but you could talk about it as I think we used a term on this show once before. We talked about turbocharged philanthropy with
Right.
lots of verification, and it does get pretty. I mean, yeah, I can go on. There are a lot of performance bonds are being used to do this, like in the U.S. To try to expand habitat for bison or something, where you can get a bond where the money goes in to move bison around and shuffle them from place to place so that they're able to adapt better to their environment. And then you generate credits on the back end. So the bond will actually pay the bondholder going interest rates, and any additional amount is a performance payment if they can sell credits. So there's all kinds of different tools that are emerging. Yeah, it is really interesting.
So it's a kind of social impact bond. In this case, a social impact bond for bison, something like that. Yeah, same sort of principle. Yeah. That's a very, very interesting thing. Actually, someday we'll probably come back and just talk about that for a while, because I think it's some of the interesting instruments are really, really intriguing. I'm just minded, actually, I want to quickly move the conversation to one side, because we've got a great question here coming from Anne Berg, our sometime resident guest and also permanent commodity expert watching the show. Thanks, Anne, for your question. Thanks, gentlemen. Steve, how do you view the current state of carbon reduction policies by the populous Asian countries, India, China, particularly?
Yeah, that's I don't know if I can really answer the bigger policy issues. I'm detached from it the last year or so. What I do know is how they're approaching their market mechanisms. I know that what India and Indonesia and these countries are doing is they are trying to promote domestic carbon markets so that they can grow their industry without exporting emission reductions, and by financing emission reductions at home. But on the larger policies, I'd have to look at their NDCs. And I probably know less than someone who's been reading the newspaper every day. I just don't know what their latest NDCs. The NDCs are nationally determined contributions, and every country publishes them. Mm-hmm. And I should know that, but I just don't. I'm sorry, Anne.
Well, let me ask you a question in another way, actually, out of curiosity, because you talk a lot about the product side. You've just talked about these intriguing bison bonds, which I have to say have really got something roaming across my mind's eye with great interest. Actually, it's a lovely image altogether. I'm left thinking, gosh, can you sponsor the bison maybe for a bond? A few $1,000s with a bit of, I don't know, whatever you can get, eco-friendly paint that doesn't affect their skin. Anyway, the thing that I think is interesting there is the product development. Where is that being driven from? Because you talk about China and India trying to create their markets, but are they predominantly just trying to create sort of the markets in the image of what's already been done in the US and Europe? So where's the product innovation coming from then?
What I can speak to is the land change, the land
Okay.
use front, and
Yep.
it's basically in Indonesia. I know better than India or China. But I know that I know that China has actually been really big on using on water markets. China is an interesting country in that they deforested the entire country, and then going back as a result of that, they were having a lot of floods. So going back about 20, 30 years, they started to reforest, and the reforesting was being financed in part through payments for watershed services. So they were using water funds to reforest because that was bringing back the forest was actually increasing the water supply. So that was something that China did. What's happening in both Indonesia and India is that they are they're taking these methodologies that groups like Vera and Gold Standard have developed, and they're adopting them for themselves. There's negotiations going on with these standard setting bodies too. There's a big question as to whether they're going to create their own standard, whether they're going to create their own registry, whether they're going to use an international registry. They just don't know. I mean, Indonesia had a moratorium on exports of carbon credits for a while, just because they had decided, and they decided this in 2015. They'd already warned everybody that they, because there's this other there's an issue here that I didn't touch on, but we talk about corresponding adjustments, and that's
Mm-hmm.
if you're going to, if it doesn't really apply to voluntary markets. Some people say it should, and that basically means if I'm a German company and I finance an emission reduction program in Indonesia, and then should Indonesia reduce its, should those carbon credits be credited to Germany's emissions, or to Indonesia's? And the consensus is, in the voluntary market, the carbon credits go to Indonesia, the German company gets to claim, but the German company can't make the claim against the German government's emissions. I hope that made sense.
No, that makes sense.
And Indonesia had
Mm.
put it on hold because they wanted to make sure they were clear on everything. So what Indonesia is starting to do now is they want their own industry to have first crack at buying domestic carbon credits, because they feel like that is a way that they can grow their industrial side while still shoring up their land use side, so maintaining their forests and everything like that.
But I mean, that's really interesting, because what you're essentially saying is one of the big issues here, and this is still a marketplace relatively in its infancy, is just defining big issues. I mean, what you're talking about there in terms of who gets the credit for the carbon credit, that sounds to me like the difference between gross national product and gross domestic product, because essentially one of them is what you produce in the country and the other is what you produce anywhere, but it's because it's your money coming from your country that actually owns the capital that's doing it. And I can see exactly how that becomes a very, very interesting debate. So, I mean, bearing in mind the fact that we've already had a wonderful nearly 1 hour of conversation, it's just been fascinating to see. And I think there's so much more to talk about. I'm really interested to talk some more about some of these very, very interesting products that are going on, not just the bison bonds, but looking at that, and in this very dynamic market where we're clearly seeing progress across that, and bearing in mind the fact you're really specialized in the land-based stuff. I mean, Steve, where do you think the capital market revolution, the carbon market revolution, goes next?
I actually think nature positivity is going to be much bigger, despite the fact that there's no clear land, no clear demand signal. There is I think the desire for companies to establish themselves in this space is going to get bigger and bigger. And the other thing that's going to happen is it is going to be related to carbon somehow, because as we go into with climate change, all forests are kind of in danger. You've got the immediate threat of forests being chopped down by humans, but you've also got just degradation caused by from heat related degradation, and the need to maintain forests. They need to be actively managed, and that you're going to have to finance it somehow. And so I do think this issue, this carbon or this nature positivity movement, I think there's more to it than we can see right now, but I also don't know that we know what it's going to be. The demand side is going to be difficult. You're going to have clear claims, and you're going to have somehow related to supply chain issues. And one other one, another big one that's going to be, I think, going to be really big in carbon is soil. And this has there's been this debate going on for 20 years. When they started to create these methodologies for avoided deforestation, there was a huge debate within Vera. With some people were saying, well, why go into all this stuff about avoided deforestation? Most deforestation is caused by expanding agriculture, and if we go into soil carbon at the forest edge, that will save the forest. And this whole thing started actually as an agroforestry project where they realized that the impact on the forest was more than the impact on the soil. But as with the new soil carbon methodologies, that is a much clearer benefit. And I think the soil carbon stuff is really going to take off for a short while. It's, the way these are designed is once something becomes common practice, the carbon payments don't really matter anymore, because in theory, soil carbon is the kind of thing that'll pay for itself over time because it usually increases yields, but it will help it'll help de-risk that transition. So I think those are the two big things: is the soil carbon is going to be much bigger in the near term, and this nature positivity is going to mutate into something. It's just not clear what.
Well, the joys of nature positivity and looking at our soil carbon, there's something to the new navel gazing. No, I don't mean that to be sarcastic. It certainly sounds like a very nerdy profession, but nonetheless, it's vitally important. The quality of soil. I don't mean to be unreasonable to that, but it's certainly going to be, well, something that you involve you having to get messy. Speaking of messy, I'm terribly sorry, Christmas scene of messy times. We just didn't get time to get to your question. It only appeared on my screen the last few seconds, so sorry about that. I want to say a huge thank you, Steve, for coming and joining the show once again. It's been really, really interesting. I'd love to get you back to talk some more about these products and other issues, because there's so much happening. In the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, you gotta go listen to Steve's absolutely fantastic podcast. It's really, really worth a listen. He has all manner of very, very interesting guests. I mean it in no disrespect. He has lots of guests that I've never heard of who all turn out to be interesting, and I think that's one of the best things you can ever say about a podcast at all points in time. Thank you very, very much, Christmas City. Great chat. Thanks, Steve and Patrick. But do check that out, the Bionic Planet. It's an absolutely fabulous podcast from start to finish. We do not have a show next week, ladies and gentlemen, because funnily enough, it's our production crew are going to be off because they're going to be celebrating a Philippine Independence Day, and a very happy Independence Day to one and all there. That's presumably a day you can get in and practice for July the 4th, where you get the opportunity to celebrate Independence Day of 60.5% of the world's market capitalization. So the next episode will be on the 18th of June. We've got the very super experienced Keith Vermaas. He's going to be talking about his view from the Channel Islands and the International Stock Exchange there. Something very, very different. A change of pace, ladies and gentlemen. Looking forward to that show. It only remains for me to say a huge thank you to our fabulous production team today. Thank you very much to Jamil, Rushlin and Racy, to Anberg and Chris Messina for adding to the excitement and discussion that was going on. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to leave us a little bit of love, ladies and gentlemen. It helps the AI understand what great content we've had here. I wish you all a very, very useful, helpful and carbon-rich future in the best possible sense of the word. Thanks to Steve Zwick again for being our guest. My name is Patrick L. Young. I wish you all a great week in life and markets.
Thank you.